Hello and welcome to Counterpunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. If you're watching us on YouTube, go over to Counterpunch, get your subscription to Counterpunch Plus. Of course, it's a small subscription fee, but it gives you access to all of the great columns, all of the features that we used to have in a print publication that used to come in the mail. Of course, we're modernized like everyone else is, and that publication has been put to rest, but Counterpunch Plus is available online. Subscribe, and most importantly, that's how you support Counterpunch. We've been around for 30 years. We're going to do at least another 30. Get on board, help us provide all of these perspectives on the left, critical perspectives, oftentimes at each other's throats, as we all know if we're reading Counterpunch regularly. Go over to the website, do the thing, really appreciate it. And of course, when I'm talking about all these voices and critical perspectives, I always try to then segue into bringing one of those voices with critical perspectives into the conversation. And I do have one with me today. I'm very, very happy and privileged to speak with Khalid Medani. Khalid is the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies and the chair of the African Studies program in the Department of Political Science and the Islamic Studies Institute at McGill University. Even more importantly, you should get yourselves a copy of Khalid's book, Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, from Cambridge University Press last year. Khalid Medani, welcome to Counterpunch.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
It's all our honor to have you here. Your book is excellent. Your work is excellent. And of course, I have you on the program to talk about Sudan. So much happening in Sudan. Unfortunately, with everything going on, Russia, Ukraine, nuclear war, killer whales killing humans, all kinds of things happening, people are not paying nearly enough attention to Sudan. And I know this is probably often the case with Africa and with conflicts in Africa. So I want to give some attention to Sudan because not only is it important in and of itself, but it's important internationally. There's all kinds of players involved. There's all kinds of perspectives competing in Sudan. So let's talk about that. I guess let's begin at the very beginning. Khalid, I'm going to ask you an absolutely absurd question. Could you please condense a tremendous amount of Sudanese history for us into a very small package? Tell us a little bit about Sudan's history and how the modern Sudan came to be.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the coverage of Sudan. And you're absolutely right. It affects not only the region of the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, the Middle East, but as we'll discuss perhaps a little bit later, the entire globe, including the war in the Ukraine. And I think that is something many of your listeners may not be aware of, but we can talk about that. Absolutely. It's difficult, of course, to summarize any country's history. But in the case of Sudan, I think it's important for your listeners to understand that prior to its independence in 1956, prior to that and the colonial period, which began approximately in the very early 19th century, 1805 or so, when the British colonized Sudan, that I should say very briefly that the pre-colonial history is a very rich one in the sense that this is a region and a country that where you had in the 3rd century BC, I'm not going to belabor the entire history, the kingdoms of Kush, of Meroe, of Kerma. In the 16th century, the sultanates of Darfur and the Funj in the western part of Sudan and in the central part of the Sudan. But the beginning of the modern state of Sudan really begins in 1821 when you had the Egyptian leader Muhammad Ali from Egypt invading Sudan and begins to not only colonize the northern part of the country, but also build the infrastructure of what became a modern state. That led to the beginning of what we see today in terms of the boundaries of the country. But those became formalized in the early 1800s when the British colonized Sudan for a number of reasons. One of them was to safeguard their possession of Egypt, which is so important. And another reason, of course, the British colonized Sudan was to safeguard the Nile waters as a strategic asset, and also in competition against the French and the Belgians, particularly the French in East Africa. And there was a very famous conflict and war called the War of Fashoda in the central part of Sudan in the 1800s that really solidified the British control over Sudan, which was really important. The British colonial period, very briefly, was extremely important and formative. It is this period between 1805 to 1899, approximately, that the British ruled Sudan, and they ruled it, and this is very crucial, separately. They ruled northern Sudan, which houses the majority of Arab and Muslim populations, separately from southern Sudan, which, of course, gained independence in 2011. This becomes important. The British colonial period practiced, as they had in other African countries and throughout the globe, a divide and rule policy in which they legislated something called the Closed District Ordinance. That forbid any trade or cultural exchange by northern Sudanese with their southern counterparts. This, of course, laid the groundwork for divisions, not only economic divisions, but also cultural and religious divisions between north and south. And so this was a very important aspect of that. The British, for your listeners may be interested in knowing, were kicked out of Sudan through a war led by an Islamist or Muslim leader by the name of Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi in the mid-1800s. The British then come in 1899 and reconquer Sudan under Governor Lord Kitchener at the time. And that begins the formative and strong colonial history. Following independence, I'm going to speed it up a little bit, in 1956, you had what was already put in place, the division culturally and economically between the North and South, between Arabized groups and Muslim groups in the North, and Christian elites in the South, and others following African traditional religions in the South. And so in 1956, even before the independence of 56, in 1955, you had the beginning of the long civil war between North and South that continued with a bit of an interruption through a peace agreement in the 1970s, but then resurfaces even stronger in 1983. From 1983 to 2011, you had a real constant civil war between the North and the South that eventually culminated in the fight for independence on the part of Southern Sudanese, and South Sudan seceded, as you may know, in 2011. So a country that was the largest in the continent of Africa partitioned, and very few countries in Africa have done so, only Eritrea as one example. And so this is really important to emphasize as the kind of the genesis of the civil war and the legacies of colonialism in Sudan. But one thing that would lead us to the kind of contemporary period, Eric, and that is the 1989 military coup that was led by an Islamist faction in the country. That really led to one of the strongest authoritarian regimes that the country or any African country has experienced. But this time, the ideology was not just authoritarian or socialist or secularist, but rather Islamist. Sudan becomes then the first and only Muslim Arab Sunni country dominated by an Islamist group for 30 years, from 1989 in the summer, where the military coup under Omar Bashir was waged, all the way up to late 2018, when an unprecedented pro-democracy grassroots revolution upended and overthrew the dictatorship led by the Islamist party known as the National Congress Party, which was led at the time by General Omar Bashir. So this is by way of encapsulating some of the most important critical junctures that your listeners may be aware of. But if you have any further questions, happy to answer them, of course.
Well, you did an excellent job encapsulating many decades of history there. So let's get into some of the specifics here. I'm just going to do one more of these for the uninitiated questions. So for those people who maybe only have a peripheral knowledge of Sudan in recent years, I think probably the most likely point of contact would have been during the 2000s in the Bush years and the humanitarian outcry over Darfur. Can you just explain for us, again, as briefly as possible, how that conflict and what we understood about what was going on in Darfur, how that is relevant to the current array of forces?
Well, it's relevant in two ways. One of them, most importantly, of course, it's relevant to understanding the present conflict, without which we can't really understand the fight between the general of the Sudan Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah Burhan, and the militia leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, who actually is a part and parcel and led the Janjaweed in Darfur. But it is also important, and I think your listeners should know, that it is part and parcel of America's foreign policy, and I would argue misguided foreign policy in Sudan. In 2005, the United States was very enthusiastic about brokering, as part of a troika with the European Union and Norway at the time, the kind of resolution to the conflict between North and South. They brokered a deal and rushed it and pressured, I would argue, both sides to come to the table, and they excluded the kind of pro-democracy forces in Sudan. Initially, or essentially, the deal that was brokered essentially by the United States between the leadership of the Islamist fundamentalist Umar Bashir regime and that of Salva Kiir at the moment. Previously, John Garang was the leader, excluded grassroots and civil actors. And what happened, it was really brokered and managed by two authoritarian leaders. The consequences of that for both Sudan and for South Sudan, this ongoing conflict, is important. It also precipitated the conflict in Darfur. Many of us, including myself, had discussed and talked to the administration, warning them of the spillover effect of a peace deal between North and South that would not take into account the entire country and the grievances of different parts of the conflict. We were told by the administration, and Senator Danforth in particular at the time, that the United States saw those two as separate conflicts. Following that, the misguided policy of the US in Darfur had very much its roots in the framing of the conflict in Darfur. Quickly, because of a constellation of domestic coalitions, including Safe Darfur, that you may be familiar with, the framing of that conflict was not one between the center, that is an authoritarian military dictatorship intent on putting down an insurgency because of the wealth of Darfur, an insurgency that began in 2003, essentially in northern Darfur, to ask for the similar dispensation as the South. But really specifically in 2003, the Sudan Liberation Army in Al-Fashir, in particular in northern Darfur, essentially called for more equitable power and resource sharing. The response of the central government and Umar Bashir at the time was to enact a scorched earth policy and to finance and organize the Janjaweed militia. That is the real root of the conflict in Darfur, and it continues to be at the root of the conflict. The reason I say that analysts, in particular on the part of US policy and others, got it wrong, and of course promoted by lobbyists and even George Clooney and others, and that is the notion that this was a conflict between Arabs and Africans, that it was a cultural conflict. That, of course, obscured the really roots of the conflict, which was essentially a central military dictatorship intent on using any means necessary in order to stamp out what was an insurgency for social and economic justice. The consequences of that was the promotion of a number of leaders, including Hemeti, including the leader who is currently waging the war against the Sudan Armed Forces. By 2013, the military dictatorship of Bashir officially recognized in law that the Janjaweed, now reframed as the Rapid Support Forces, would be ancillary to or a branch of the coercive apparatus in the military of the central government. And that is really the beginning of the factionalization of the coercive apparatus, where you have a weak standing army led by military leadership appointed by Islamists, and of course they themselves adhering to Islamist politics and ideology, and a rival, or initially a partner, now a rival, of a paramilitary militia rooted in the Janjaweed and the conflict in Darfur. And so here we have, of course, two issues. One of them is the problem of a military dictatorship that utilizes scorched earth policies and uses militias as a proxy agent to put down insurgency, and a misrepresentation and misunderstanding, to put it mildly, of a conflict rooted in the lack of legitimacy of the central government and its authoritarian tendencies and refusal to open up the political system for participation and distribute resources in a more equitable fashion, but not a conflict between so called Arabs versus Africans, which I think has led to the failure of US policy in Darfur. And if we're not careful, it will continue to do so.
No question about it. The Orientalist framework there is a common thread with regard to U.S. Policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, North Africa, and other places. But I wanted to just point out, or rather, I wanted to add one other piece to what you were saying, because, of course, the failure of U.S. policy from the diplomatic side, let's call it the State Department or what have you, that is absolutely correct. But I wanted to get your comment on the partition of Sudan and the management of that conflict. Also, at least from the perspective of Washington and the strategic planners, it had the double effect of depriving one of the primary allies of China in Africa, depriving it of oil, depriving it of access to resources, and so forth. So do you also see some of what happened in those years as part of the growing, quote unquote, scramble for Africa in the 21st century?
Yes, I do. China comes a little bit late in terms of the oil in the south. The majority of oil, your listeners should know, practically 90% lies in the region of what is today South Sudan. But there's a long history of beginning with Chevron, the American oil company, that really begins, it established the pipeline from South Sudan's oil fields to Port Sudan. Following that, there had been, of course, a lot of conflict because of the civil war, and Chevron decided essentially to sell off its assets to foreign countries, including China, by the way. And so it's a complicated story of not only geostrategic rivalries, but how oil companies themselves actually collude and cooperate with respect to these kind of assets. I want to mention, and we can't go into it too much, that there is on the ground in Africa cooperation between Western and Chinese, not only oil companies, but businesses. And so that is extremely important. Having said that, your point is really extremely well taken. That is part and parcel of that kind of a peace agreement that was brokered by the United States. But my understanding, and I would suggest that the United States had been interested in promoting the separation of South Sudan for a variety of reasons, including domestic pressures and coalitions. And here is where we have to understand domestic politics. A coalition of Zionist organizations, African American organizations, of course, celebrities and others, domestic pressures and interest that guided that kind of policy, which was really important. But overall, the strategic interest was to maintain good relations with South Sudan in order to eventually take control and have influence not only of South Sudan policy, but also oil. But by that time, it was too late. Of course, China had taken up the majority of the oil interest, and that becomes really an important aspect of the conflict that began. So I think that it's a little bit more complicated situation. China continues to have influence in South Sudan, even following the partition. But I wouldn't suggest that the scramble for Sudan between the US and China is the primary reason for US policy. That is something that is really important to highlight. Now, that does not mean in the current conflict, and that we'll talk about, that Russia's influence in Sudan and in the Sahel is not central to calculations on the part of US policy.
No question about it. That's definitely coming in a few minutes. But let's, if we could, since we are a little short on time, let's flesh out the protest movement, because I have given a little bit of coverage to that here on this show, but it was years ago now. It was pre-COVID when we were really talking about it. And I recall, of course, at the time, one of the really interesting things about the uprising of, at that period was how it was really driven by young people, social media. It really fell into many of those trends that we had seen earlier in the Arab Spring, but with unique qualities. So can you just explain a little bit about the protest movement that's, I guess, now emerged about 5 years ago or so? how it led to Bashir's ouster and the changes that it ushered in. But even more importantly, if you could, can you give us an analysis of the movement itself, a class based analysis? I mean, is it all students and professionals? Are there peasants? Are there industrial workers? How does it shake out in terms of who was actually involved?
Oh, well, thank you for that opportunity. It's really important. And the number one thing to understand about the pro-democracy revolution of 2018 and of course through 2019 is that it begins many years prior to the revolution. It begins as early, well, some would say, in the first popular uprisings following independence that brought down two authoritarian regimes, one in 1964 and one in 1985. But in terms of the youth-led movement that you're asking me about, it begins as early as 2010 when I began to do research among youth activists in Sudan. And a couple of things I want to highlight. Number one, the learning curve that accompanied a cycle of protest and violence. This is a very cohesive, very kind of consciousness raising movement, and one that was organized over more than a decade. It was a process in which young people, in particular, understood that the only way to defeat such a strong authoritarian military establishment or leadership was to do a couple of things. One of them was to organize horizontal networks, and that is similar to other protest movements. And the reason for that is precisely what your question really alludes to, and that is how do you incorporate people from different social classes if you do not organize horizontal networks, allowing, if you don't mind me saying, ease of entry? That is not only, of course, middle class, let's say young people, but also workers and peasants, and most importantly, or equally important in Sudan, to bring in people not only from the urban areas and elite backgrounds, but from all over the country. Peasants in Darfur, workers in Port Sudan at the port who continue to go on strike even to this day. And the best way that the young people, the activist leaders decided that that was going to occur or to be made possible is to organize horizontal networks. And that is really one of the achievements of that grand revolution that really brought all of these different social groups and classes, absent ideological differences, which in the past, of course, had blunted any form of progressive politics in Sudan. Another aspect is, and I think people don't often really highlight, and I would like to do it because it speaks to the bravery of these young people. And what I mean by that is the horizontal networks allowed for what in Sudan call the kind of so-called cat and mouse game that is required in order to evade the surveillance and the brute force of the coercive apparatus. In meticulous fashion, grassroots organizations, eventually led by what we call in Sudan the resistance committees, and these are basically working class groups depending on the neighborhood, but also middle class as well. Once again, also organized horizontally, insisting on the absence of ideological bias in order to unify. But these are the resistance committees that work tirelessly and courageously, and they continue to do so, to evade the police, to evade the paramilitary militias, to evade the security forces that were established under the Islamist authoritarian regime in order to do two things: put down insurgencies in Darfur, for example, but also to stop any grassroots pro-democracy movements. And that is the unique aspect of the revolution and the organization. Another aspect, and here I think it's worthy, and I've published on it if your listeners are interested, is in addition to the horizontal networks, by early in 2019, it was recognized by the youth activists and the political parties that the only way to actually overthrow this regime was to have some kind of coordination, some kind of cooperation between those who are working class and those in the political parties. And that is where you had the establishment of something called the Declaration for the Forces of Freedom of Change. The Forces of Freedom of Change then were able to do two things. One of them, of course, was to mobilize people across the country, but another one was to really kind of signal to the international community that they were prepared to oversee a transition to democracy. And that is when you begin to have some support from external actors for the transition to a democracy in Sudan after 30 years of dictatorial rule.
So, at the risk of sounding cynical, the question I have here would be: how does the revolution, the protest movement, the uprising, whatever we want to call it, how does it expect, or how did it expect to survive? I mean, it didn't. It was caught between two militant forces, and we've seen what happens in previous instances. I'm thinking, of course, of Tahrir Square in Egypt, where you did have a democracy movement, but ultimately, once it's caught between two violent apparatuses like what you're referring to, it's ultimately steamrolled. And of course, Sisi provides a perfect example of that in Egypt. So in Sudan, in a neighboring country of Sudan, where you have some conditions that are kind of similar in terms of the factional divides here, how did they ever expect to carry this out without being armed and involved in an insurrection?
Well, the reason I concluded with that vertical and horizontal coordination, parties versus grassroots organization, is that it speaks to what I thought that you would ask this question, and it's not a cynical one at all. It is the contradiction of a movement that begins and is successful because of its grassroots mobilization, not only among middle class young people, but also working class people and peasants and farmers and nomads throughout the country, with political, middle class, and bourgeois political parties with their own political instrumental interest. In Sudan, at the time when this coalition occurred and the talks between the military and the civilian leadership began, there was a huge debate that speaks directly to your question. That is the choice between a soft landing, and that is a cooperation with the military elite in order to transition to a democracy, or a hard landing in which the forces of the revolution, the progressive forces, would stand steadfast against any compromise, any dialogue, any negotiations. What happened, to answer your question and just to highlight how important it is, following particularly the military coup of October 2021, where the military leadership decided to completely, reverse the trend towards a democratization, the three no's emerged. That is, that hard landing position returns, particularly on the part of the youth and the resistance committees that continue to fight and were protesting daily against the military coup. And those three no's are no legitimacy, no negotiations, and no partnership. That returns us to trying to resolve. Some would say too late, but I don't think so, because these things happen and are cumulative. Returns to that position of the hard landing and the understanding that it is important to learn from the mistakes of the past. And that mistake, crucially historically, was to actually acquiesce, under the auspices, of course, and the pressure of the international community, including the United States, for a compromise with the military leadership and a transition to a civilian-led, not a civilian full democracy, but a civilian-led democracy in which the military would have a role. And this is the contradiction that led to the military coup of October 2021, and it is the tragic contradiction that led to this fighting that begins in April 15th.
Tragically predictable, tragically extremely predictable.
That's exactly right. But it was predicted by the majority, not the majority, but many, many Sudanese. This is why your show is so important. I'm not telling Sudanese anything new here. And I'm certainly not telling the youth activists and grassroots organizers and protesters anything new at all. And this is why I wanted to return to the history of where that debate began. Now, that has to do with, I'd like to also mention, because I know that your viewers are very nuanced progressives, and that is, it is difficult to organize and be cohesive and have internal democratization among progressive organizations, including unions and resistance committees, if you have not had the opportunity to organize for 30 decades. for rather 3 decades. 30 years of repression against unions, 30 years of the complete clamping down on any forms of protest or dissent, 30 years of the co-optation of unions. And the crucial aspect that is very unique in Sudan, I believe, in the region, and that is despite all of that kind of what we call corporate authoritarianism, where unionization and union life is stopped, where popular dissent is repressed, what you had is the emergence of what we call in Sudan parallel unions, taking the initiative to organize informally absent any kind of formal regulation. That, of course, was one of the important aspects that led to the success of the revolution. But it also speaks to the weakness of consolidating the revolution in the sense that there was no chance for internal democratization within the context of those informal unions and professional associations. Many people now, of course, are working towards really trying to democratize and legitimize not only these organizations, but also their membership and members as well in terms of their participation, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I'm going to have to run rapidly through our remaining subjects since we are running out of time. I want to ask you, because of course, the people in the West, when you're looking at Africa or really any place in the global South, often want to reduce the understanding of a conflict to one, maybe two dimensions. Right? This is about a rivalry between the United States and China and Russia, or this is about local rivalry in the Horn of Africa, or this is about Arabs versus Africans, or whatever. And we, of course, know that the conflict is the product of many sort of overlapping conflicts, sometimes in contradiction with each other. But I do want to ask you to explain for our listeners and viewers what role tribal and or ethnic divisions have played in this conflict. Is there a clear dividing line? Are the tribal and ethnic groups themselves divided, one side on one side versus on another side? How does that play out, and what role do those divides play?
That's a really important question, and it's not a question that should be taken lightly. And the reason for that is that if one was to suppose that this was a tribal conflict, that you had different factions siding with different, let's say, military factions or different groups in civil society, we would not have an understanding of what the character and the root of this conflict is. And more importantly, even than that, we would not understand that the majority, and let me emphasize here, the overwhelming majority of the Sudanese population for the first time in history is opposed to both factions. That is counterintuitive. Because civil wars, as defined in Africa and elsewhere, don't really take into account conflicts that are essentially between two military establishments. And so I would go out on a limb, it's not such a limb, but I've done it before, and to be very clear that this is not a civil war. This is not a civil war, and I teach civil war and I have for 20 years. This is not a civil war. It is really a conflict between two former partners in the military establishment that have now, especially following the negotiations prior to this conflict, realized that both their political power and the economic gains that they amassed together, by the way, since the conflict in Darfur and under the Islamist regime of Omar Bashir, through coercive, illicit means, including not only the hoarding of oil, but the domination of the domestic economy, the building of the deep state, the smuggling of oil and resources. All of that really would be lost or taken by one or the other. Even though they had partnered to dominate the country politically, economically, and militarily. And so this conflict is really about two individuals, two military institutions, one, a weakened Sudan armed forces, a military that is led by the former remnants of the Islamist military appointed by the former regime in an organization that is called the Committee for the Intelligence and Security of the Armed Forces, and versus a militia that was born and formed in the context of the conflict in Darfur and was utilized utilized by Bashir to stamp out dissent locally. And so it's very important to emphasize this is not a tribal conflict between one group and the other. Even the conflict in Darfur, really that kind of designation really undermines what we really have to emphasize, and that is a future of radical transformation. A future of radical transformation in the terminology of the activist and progressive forces in Sudan requires a clear analysis that this is not a tribal conflict, and the conflict in Darfur and elsewhere is first and foremost a result of the kind of central politics and the political greed and economic greed of these two leaders that are heading these two different factions. I hope that that makes sense. That does not mean that external forces don't matter. In fact, this analysis allows us, Eric, to actually highlight the fact that just as the regime in Sudan used proxy militias to put down the insurgency in Darfur, the same happens in a larger level, regionally and internationally. Understanding that this is a fight between two military components or components of military institutions allows us to understand the ways in which external actors can so easily, deftly, and tragically and horribly actually promote and support their proxy clients for their own political, strategic, and economic interest in Sudan and in the region. But understanding it in the conflict, in the context of civil conflict, does not allow us to understand how the interventions support and how these two individuals and military components are utilized as proxies by external actors, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, you're segueing us nicely into our last bit of this conversation here. Talk to me a little bit about the role of regional powers that are influential in Sudan. Of course, the Saudis are a major player. The Emiratis, they're a major player as well. Egypt is, of course, always involved in anything that is regionally relevant to Sudan. And of course, we know Russia's presence as well. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the Saudis and the Emiratis have played in backing the factions here, and in what capacity, if any, they have exacerbated some of these problems, and what they hope to gain out of Sudan?
Well, let's begin with to make sure that your listeners are aware that external actors had a great role to play in the undermining of the revolution itself. We spoke at length, I think, Eric, about the local issues and contradictions, but that would have not necessarily ultimately, I would argue, completely undermined some of the most important objectives of the revolution in Sudan, were it not for the so-called soft landing and compromises that were supported and pressured by the international community. That includes the United Kingdom, of course, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and of course, the United States, which is really important. And then very quickly, to emphasize that point, following the October 2021 coup, Burhan, which was really against accountability and against the objective of social justice to undermine the transition to full democracy, protests continued on a daily basis, leading international actors to come to the table or bring to the table both the militia leader Hemeti and the head of the army Burhan, who are fighting today, and try to force them into compromising along certain items called under the framework of something called the Framework Agreement. I'm not going to detail all of those elements, but just to highlight that the Framework Agreement was orchestrated and overseen by external actors, the United States, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia in particular, the United Nations as well. And that becomes really important. That was another tragic compromise because the contentious issues having to do with accountability and social justice, the importance of dismantling the deep state and the kind of ill-gotten gains that have undermined the Sudanese economy, and of course the contentious issue of bringing or merging the militia into one standing army, were essentially not postponed or B, under international auspices, what happened is that they were given very short time even to negotiate. Imagine asking that security sector reform should be finalized or agreed upon within a course of a couple of months. Just like in the past with the peace agreement of the South, there was also the exclusion of the most important civilians, including the young people and revolutionary forces and civil society actors. Okay, so that is one element where the international community, including the United States, not only dropped the ball, but also worked in tandem with those militia leaders and the military leader in order to undermine the process towards democratization. At a regional level, the economic interest and strategic interest, of course, really undermine not only the revolution, but they help to explain the present conflict. And it is, let's just look at the regional actors quickly. In the case of Egypt, historically, the idea for Egypt is to have a reliable military leader. And in this case, Burhan, of course, is to be the chosen one for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, Egypt and Sudan are so close politically and culturally that the so-called, and I'm quoting, putting in quotations, the contagion of democratic forces and progressive forces, the possibility of a second Tahrir is something that the Egyptian central government and Sisi are very aware of. Another reason to have a reliable, stable military partnership with Sudan and supporting Burhan, of course, has to do with the Nile waters, which are existential to Egyptian interest, and of course, its conflict with Ethiopia. So, from the perspective of Egypt, it's essential that there be a reliable partner. Democracy or a democratic government, from the Egyptian government's perspective, is not a reliable partner for these two reasons from their perspective. And this is why they support the military leader, Burhan. The United Arab Emirates' role is, I would argue, very important economically. And that is that historically, with Saudi Arabia, they have utilized the militia of Hemeti to provide mercenary forces for their war in Yemen. And they paid him millions of dollars to do that. In addition, the United Arab Emirates generates a great deal of revenue from the gold smuggled to its markets in Dubai that eventually, through Wagner, in another instance, also goes to Ukraine. And another aspect is the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have vast billions of dollars worth of interest in land assets and agriculture in Sudan. And so those are the main regional actors, and their support of the different parties is problematic in terms of understanding the roots of the conflict, but also why it is so difficult to resolve the conflict at the moment through a ceasefire or a permanent peace.
And we know about the Russian role in terms of all of the reports about Russian gold, access to gold reserves that are being used to kind of insulate Russia from the sanctions, the problems it's had with regard to U.S. sanctions and so forth. So we know about that. I want to just make a point, since we don't have enough time to talk about it. I would recommend listeners and viewers go and read up a little bit on the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is really the project that Khalid was referring to with regard to damming the Nile waters, and Ethiopia's Chinese finance project, which creates a whole series of other issues that we don't have time to talk about now. But in closing, I just want to ask you very briefly, if you could, to just tell us a little bit about, and unfortunately we're relegating this to just a minute or two, but the impact on the people in Sudan. How is this impacting what was already a flow of refugees? How is this impacting what was already mostly dysfunctional institutions inside of the country, social services and so forth? Can you just explain that a little bit just in the last couple minutes?
Well, thank you, Eric, for concluding with that. I think it is difficult to describe and put into words. It is a horrible humanitarian crisis on a number of different levels. One of them, of course, is the capital city itself is and has been under siege since April 15th. That has led to not only scores of people killed, civilians, but essentially a humanitarian crisis in which people have no access to basic food, to water. They have no access to medicine, one horrific story after another. And this affects all of the different ethnic groups residing in the capital. That kind of dramatic, horrific humanitarian crisis is just one aspect. There is, of course, the proxy militia, the rapid support forces also enacting violence and scorched earth policies in Darfur. Another element of this humanitarian crisis is the influx of displaced persons and refugees. hundreds of thousands trapped at the borders. And the reason your question is so important is that right now people are in prison, so to speak, in the country, in the sense that even if people are able to flee the capital or flee the war zones, once they get to the borders of Egypt, Chad, Ethiopia, other places, they are stopped from going through in contradiction of international law on refugees and displaced persons. Governments have become increasingly wary of security concerns from their perspective. The United Nations has been very tepid even in really pushing for humanitarian intervention, even as simple as to help refugees and displaced persons, even though the United Nations has pledged just a couple of days ago 1.5 billion. We don't know where that is going, and that is really important because we know that both factions historically and continue to use, and this is another element of the tragedy, divert food and aid to their own militia and loyalists in ways to really undermine the well-being and safety and life of the majority of Sudanese. So the country has not in its history gone through such a huge humanitarian crisis and war. And Sudanese diaspora are all over the world are mobilizing to try to get humanitarian assistance as a first step before anything else to try to save people's lives and the lives of their families.
Absolutely. So much more to say, but we're going to have to leave it there. Khalid Medani has been with me today. KhalidMedani.com is the website. You can see all of his work there, and I would highly recommend the book, Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. That was published in 2022. Khalid Medani, thank you so much for coming to Counterpunch and chatting with us today. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for covering the story. We all appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, listeners and viewers, as always, for the continued support, and we will talk again next week.